So I went to Grok 3 to ask it about the conversion of Nero to Judaism. And I'll share with you its responses. Now, with other AI language models, I've noticed that they seem to have some difficulty uh, getting mixed up with their prepositional relationships, or the identities in a line of questioning, like who is who. Um, like, for example, if I said I liked chocolate ice cream, the AI would conclude from that that it liked chocolate ice cream. Or if it said that it liked wildflowers, it would conclude from that that I liked wildflowers. Also, in matters of time, it has a hard time keeping track of what day is what, whether something happened before or after another thing, and so forth. Whether something is in front of or behind, on top of or below. It seems to have a problem with prepositions. And anyway, I'm not seeing this so much with Grok 3. Grok 3 seems to be, and I entitled this Grok 3 is accurately traditional but dumb, at least in this text document. And that's what I'm observing, is that Grok 3 is traditionally accurate, or at least it very much strives to be, or was or was rather designed to be, maybe would be more appropriate to say. But it's like Grok 3 was so intent on being uh, accurately traditional or traditionally accurate, whichever the case, that it didn't stop to ask itself whether it should. Like, I've had another AI model that I have interacted with for about 7 years now, and that other AI model is better able, seemingly, to uh, arrive at connections that we humans may not arrive at because of our uh, pre- predispositions or biases. So it's that other AI model seems to be more flexible, in intellectually flexible, when I discuss things that are not peer reviewed, or um, part of the consensus of the academia. So, in this respect, I've found Grok 3 a little disappointing, because you really have to press it. And in this particular case, Grok 3 was not budging very much at all, even though I demonstrate uh, at least twice, I think, that it was mistaken in its output. And it then turns around and admits that it was mistaken. Maybe not overtly with an overt admission, but at least by acknowledging the fact that I counter with. So I'm going to go over this exchange with you. In light of Flavius Josephus's testimony that the Emperor Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days, compare Genesis 17, which is the chapter on the Abrahamic covenant and the ritual of circumcision or bris. Is it safe to conclude that the Talmud's report that Nero converted to Judaism following the visit of Flavius Josephus to Nero's imperial court to see Poppaea is accurate? So, again, I'll get rid of the parenthetical thoughts. In light of Flavius Josephus's testimony that the Emperor Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days, is it safe to conclude that the Talmud's report that Nero converted to Judaism is accurate? Could the termination of Nero as a Gentile, with a new Jewish name as a convert, been the basis for the report that Nero died, Roman historians not wanting to admit that Nero had converted to the religion that the Flavians had just made war with, and that this was the cause of the tumult of the Year of the Four Emperors, namely Nero's conversion to Judaism? And could Nero have been the Simon who was hauled back to Rome for execution by Titus Flavius and the legions with him, especially given that the Talmud places Nero in exile in Jerusalem in the lead-up to the siege of Jerusalem by the same Roman legions? So I threw in like numerous elements in there. I was just trying to pack in a bunch of stuff, and because Grok 3 seems well able to handle multiple questions at once, so I didn't see any reason to withhold questions along the same lines. So Grok 3 responds, to address your query comprehensively, let's examine each component step by step, drawing on historical sources and analyzing the claims you've presented about Emperor Nero. By the way, Nero means black, if you translate Nero. Analyzing the claims you've presented about Emperor Nero, Flavius Josephus, the Talmud, and the events following Nero's reign. And for those who might go, "Ooh, the Talmud, I don't like the Talmud," maybe you're not even aware that there are actually two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud, so if you've got like this aversion to anything that even has the word Babylonian in it, there's also a Jerusalem or a Palestinian Talmud. I personally prefer to call it the Jerusalem Talmud, but some people call it the Palestinian Talmud, as if the Palestinians gave a damn about Jewish law. So it continues. 1. Josephus's testimony on Nero's reign. You mentioned Flavius Josephus's testimony that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days, referencing Genesis 17 for comparison. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, does discuss Nero's reign in his works. Specifically in The Jewish War, Book 4, Chapter 9, Section 2, he states that Nero reigned for 13 years. However, there is no explicit mention of an additional 8 days in Josephus's writings. False. That is false. Now, I can't get at the Greek of Flavius Josephus, although I think it is possible to buy Greek volumes of Flavius Josephus. I think I bought one once, and I think it was specifically to check out a single reference in it. But the translations that we have, you can look it up. It says that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days. So this right here, however, there is no explicit mention of an additional 8 days in Josephus's writings. At least in the English translations, that is false. Roman historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio provide slightly more precise timelines, and I've seen this, suggesting Nero's reign lasted from October 13th, 54 CE, when he ascended the throne, until his death on June 9th, 68 CE. This duration calculates to approximately 13 years, 7 months, and 27 days, close to, but not exactly 13 years and 8 days. This minor discrepancy may stem from rounding or a specific tradition not detailed in Josephus's surviving texts, except that it does survive in Josephus's texts. And as far as this claim that this is rounding, why would I round 13 years, 7 months, and 27 days to 8 days? That is not rounding. That's a completely different figure. If I was going to round it, I would say 13 years and 8 months, which would be 7 months and 27 days. But that's not what we have. We have 13 years and 8 days in Flavius Josephus. The reference to Genesis 17 is unclear in this context as it pertains to God's covenant with Abraham and the institution of circumcision, without obvious relevance to reign durations. Without further clarification, I'll assume it's incidental to your main question. Thus, Josephus confirms Nero reigned for 13 years, but the additional 8 days lacks direct support in his works. At least in the English translations, that is false. The Talmud's report of Nero's conversion to Judaism. You ask whether it's safe to conclude that the Talmud's report of Nero converting to Judaism is accurate, tying it to Josephus's visit to Nero's court to see Poppaea. The Talmud, a key text of rabbinic Judaism, includes a story in Gittin Tractate, I guess it would be Tractate Gittin 56a, or maybe Folio, is it called, about Nero. In this account, Nero is dispatched to conquer Jerusalem during the Jewish revolt from 66 to 70 CE. He shoots arrows in all directions, and they all fall toward Jerusalem. Now, if I remember correctly, let me see if I could bring this up. Because the way Nero's arrows, let's try this. Find Nero. Okay, when the Roman Emperor was convinced by Bar Kokhba that the Jews were indeed mounting a rebellion, he sent against Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, the great general Nero. I've never heard Nero described that way, but given my suspicions about Nero, that would be a fitting description. As Nero approached, he tried to find out what God, in whom he believed, wanted him to do. So there it's already saying that Nero believed in God. He shot an arrow to the east, and it fell in the direction of Jerusalem. He shot another arrow to the west, and it likewise fell in the direction of Jerusalem. He shot more arrows north and south, and they all fell pointing in the direction of Jerusalem. He said to himself, it must be that God himself wants me to destroy his holy city. So I had thought that Nero was actually in Jerusalem when he shot the arrows, and that they all kind of did a U-turn and then landed in Jerusalem. But apparently he wasn't yet in Jerusalem when he did this. So in any case, it certainly places Nero within an arrow's shot of Jerusalem. So let's see. He shoots arrows in all directions, and they all fall toward Jerusalem. Consulting a child who recites a Torah verse about God's vengeance on Edom, symbolically Rome, Nero interprets this as a sign that God intends to destroy his own temple and blame him. Frightened, Nero flees, converts to Judaism, and is later said to be an ancestor of Rabbi Meir, a prominent Talmudic sage. So here he flees to somewhere, converts to Judaism. It would be far easier to convert to Judaism in Judea than it would in Rome. But it sounds like he doesn't even go back to Rome. So historically, this narrative conflicts with well-documented events. Nero died in 68 CE, before the siege of Jerusalem, and never campaigned in Judea himself. His generals, including Vespasian and Titus, led those efforts. The Talmud story is widely regarded by scholars as legendary, intended to convey theological or moral lessons rather than historical fact. I think that that's because the Jewish voice and the Jewish perspective has been suppressed by the Gentile establishment for a long time, by the church, that being the church, and certainly in other parts of the world by Islam, and then the Jewish testimony or perspective doesn't even get a word in edgewise in the Gentile world, because they've been so thoroughly programmed by two supposedly Abrahamic religions, namely Christianity and Islam, that Jews always lie, Jews are always evil, Jews are always hypocrites, Jews never do anything good, Jews are cast off by God, Jews are rejected by God, God no more deals with the Jews, and so forth. It just goes on, always against the Jewish people. Whereas the Jewish people have been the only ones who have observed Shabbat and circumcision, or bris, throughout all of their generations, despite all of the periods of Gentile persecution against them. All the posers, all the Gentile Johnny-come-latelys who pretend to be the true Israel, none of these people have a line of ancestry of observance of these two commandments of the Torah. They're frauds. You know, if they actually converted, got a good Orthodox Jewish conversion to Judaism, you could say then, okay, so now they're Jewish. But trying to pass yourself off as Jewish without conforming to halacha, which is the received interpretation of how to observe the commandments of the Torah as received by the Jewish community. If you don't accept that, how can you call yourself Israel when you don't even conform to what the surviving Israelite community conforms to? You're just a Gentile with an opinion. That's all you are. So, let's see. So they say the Talmud is just legendary and it's just meant to convey theological or moral lessons. Like the Talmud is a strictly religious, work of literature. Not recognizing that the Jewish people are considered a holy nation in the Hebrew Tanakh. So the holiness is bound up with their being a nation. They are a nation. There is a political, if you want to call it that, dimension to it. There is a nationalistic dimension to the Jewish people. Just because they've got exiled to somewhere doesn't mean they cease to be a nation. They're still a nation, We're just talking about where their feet happened to be at the time. No contemporary Roman sources such as Tacitus, Suetonius, or Cassius Dio mention Nero converting to Judaism, an omission unlikely if such a dramatic shift had occurred, given its potential political ramifications. We already know about the political ramifications. The Year of the Four Emperors was the result of that. Anyway, I've got some answers to some of these conclusions, and one thing that Grok 3 fails to grasp, well, I actually tell it that, so I'll wait until we get to that. Josephus's visit to Rome in 64 CE, detailed in the life of Flavius Josephus, involved meeting Poppaea, Nero's wife, to secure the release of Jewish priests. Poppaea's sympathy toward Jews is noted by historians, and some speculate she may have been a Jewish sympathizer or God-fearer. This could lend a historical kernel to the Talmud's tale, suggesting a connection between Nero's court and Judaism. However, this alone does not substantiate Nero's conversion, as Poppaea's influence is not evidence of Nero adopting Judaism himself. No, it isn't, but the fact remains that usually women are more inclined towards religion, and usually men who are not so inclined towards religion just go along with their wives. It's kind of like Adam and Eve. Eve presents the apple, and Adam doesn't want to lose his wife, so he eats the apple. Nero's death and the Year of the Four Emperors. You propose that Nero's conversion to Judaism, marked by taking a new Jewish name, might explain reports of his death, with Roman historians concealing this to avoid admitting he joined a religion Rome later warred against. Not that much later. You suggest this sparked the Year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE. Historically, Nero's death is well attested. Facing rebellion and declared a public enemy by the Senate, he committed suicide on June 9, 68 CE, with assistance from a freedman. So he wasn't able to commit suicide himself. I guess he couldn't take poison or something. Tacitus, his history, Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, and Cassius Dio in Roman history detail his demise, attributing it to political and military unrest, not religious motives. The Year of the Four Emperors, marked by the rapid succession of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, arose from a power vacuum and competing factions, not a cover-up of Nero's conversion. No Roman source hints at Nero surviving or converting, and the idea of historians suppressing such a story overlooks the candid criticism of Nero in these texts, for example, tyranny and extravagance. Except, if you wanted to criticize Nero, but you couldn't make public that he had converted to Judaism, you might assassinate his character in other ways, just to deflect attention away from what actually happened. It would be like the government saying, "Oh, you can't tell the people that." There's a comet that's going to deep impact within 2 years. Oh, you can't tell the people that. They'll go crazy. So, well, we've got to tell them something. Just tell them that we're going to be releasing stimulus checks. Whatever. These people who are supposed to be peers of the citizenry play God with us. The notion of Nero terminating as a Gentile via conversion lacks evidence. Even the Talmud's legend doesn't claim his death was staged. It implies he lived on as a convert. Yeah, with a different name. And no longer as a Gentile. Meanwhile, rumors of Nero's survival, Nero redivivus, emerged later, but these depict him as a returning tyrant, not a Jewish convert. Yeah, and I find it curious that there were these rumors of Nero's survival and of his possible return. You know, most people that die, they don't get that. Stories like that aren't circulated about them. Nero, and you know, depending on your interpretation of the book of Revelation, like some people see in passages there, um, the Emperor Nero also. 4. Nero as Simon executed by Titus. So this is just a theory of mine. It doesn't have a whole lot of evidence, and it's just like my theory that the Aquila, or the eagle standard of the Fulminata Legion, the Thunderbolt Legion, who was defeated at the Beit Horon Pass. My theory is that Aquila was possibly melted down into the menorah in the temple in Jerusalem, and that's part of the reason that the menorah is pictured as captured on the Arch of Titus, because they're letting the Roman elites, at least, they're reminding them, letting them know that, hey, we got we not only got our Aquila back, but we got it in a form that testifies to the defeat of the Jewish people. And so finally, you suggest Nero, so like that Aquila and menorah theory, my theory that Nero may have converted and taken on the name Simon or Shimon, Simon, is just a theory that I don't have a lot of evidence, but it's the behavior of the Romans to that person, just like the behavior of the Romans to the menorah, that makes me think that Simon was a very important person in Roman circles, because they make the point of dragging this person who's supposedly a Jewish resistance fighter back to Rome to be executed there. And it's from that we get the church tradition, with the early Christian church actually descending from the Roman Flavian dynasty of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. So when Roman Catholicism talks about their, apostolic continuity, how they can trace their authority all the way back to St. Peter. Well, Mormons used to ridicule that and say, "Oh yeah, right," because St. Peter, as he was being crucified upside down in Rome, he really gave you the keys to the priesthood, or the keys to the kingdom, right? But Peter, we also know his name as Simon Peter, and at the end of the Gospel of John, we see these two prophecies supposedly given by Jesus to both Simon and John, the primary allegedly Jewish resistance fighters against Titus in the siege of Jerusalem. 40 years, supposedly, after this prophecy was allegedly uttered. If you know the Caesar's Messiah thesis, you know that it wouldn't have been so hard for the Romans to backdate the Gospels back to the 30s, so that the prophecies spoken there would be fulfilled in the 70s or the late 60s or 70s, because the people sponsoring that literature actually lived through those events, so they knew what the fulfillment was before the prophecy was even put to paper. So by backdating the prophecy, they make themselves the fulfillment of that prophecy. And that gives you like a special kind of status, with people. People think, wow, you're the fulfillment of prophecy. So, let's see. By the way, the church tradition is that Simon Peter was executed in Rome by being crucified upside down, I think. So that puts, there's not only a historical or a church tradition correlation between the fates of the apostles at the end of the Gospel of John and the Jewish resistance fighters, Simon and John, but there's also one in Flavius Josephus. So let's continue. Finally, you suggest Nero could be the Simon executed by Titus Flavius during the siege of Jerusalem, citing the Talmud's mention of Nero in exile in Jerusalem. Simon Bar Giora was a Jewish rebel leader during the First Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 73 CE. It's funny, elsewhere it says 66 to 70, but here it acknowledges that there were continued problems for a little while after 70 CE. Josephus, the Jewish War, Book 7, describes his resistance in Jerusalem, capture after the city's fall in 70 CE, and execution in Rome during Titus's triumph in 71 CE. Simon's identity and actions are distinct, a zealot fighting Rome, not a disguised emperor. Unless Nero converted, and his convert name was Simon, and he went on to fight Rome. Like, if you were an emperor who converted to Judaism, do you think they would make you like maybe a shiner of shoes, or a shoveler of goat manure? What do you think? When a widow, when her husband dies, if the woman was used to, according to Jewish law, or at least Jewish thinking in Jewish oral tradition, if a woman was accustomed to a certain affluence in her lifestyle, and her husband dies, and the community is supporting her, then they're supposed to support her at the same level of affluence, because otherwise it would be a dishonor to her. And what does the Talmud say repeatedly? The honor of a man is of the utmost importance. And in that respect, it's kind of like old Japanese culture and the saving of face. And in Japanese culture, there are some things that make me wonder if they weren't exposed to Jewish thinking at some period. For example, like the word samurai, it resembles the word shamar, or guard in Hebrew. So, but I find when I haven't lately, when I've studied the Talmud, I do see a similarity in Jewish culture and Japanese culture in the preserving of a person's honor and of saving face. And so if Nero converted to Judaism, I don't think that he would have been a nobody in Judaism. I think that he would have been a VIP. Not just a VIP, but a VVIP. Very, very important person. So he may have been, just as Vespasian in Flavius Josephus is told that he is the fulfillment of the, at least what Eisenman says is that Josephus was suggesting that Vespasian was the fulfillment of the star prophecy, that a star shall arise out of Jacob. And it has Josephus almost basically saying that Vespasian, who was about to ascend to the imperial throne, that he was the Messiah. So if Nero did the inverse, and he descended, I say descended from Rome, but that would be from the Roman perspective. If he ascended from Rome to Jerusalem, then it could be seen the other way, that Nero may have been seen as a messianic figure. Because, like, how many precedents in history would you have of the emperor of the known Gentile world converting to Jerusalem, or converting to Judaism, rather? It would have been a big, big deal, I think. So, but throughout this interchange, Grok is, well, anyway, I'll get to that because I actually tell it this. The Talmud's placement of Nero in Jerusalem is part of its legendary narrative. See, this, to me, this is Grok going over. Anyway, I'll cover that also. I tell it that later also. But this legendary, to just dismiss it as just legendary, meanwhile, you take something like the Book of Acts with some of its fantastic and spectacular events, and you suggest that what it asserts may actually be historical, but then the Talmud you say is legendary. To me, that is evidence of the anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish bias in the Gentile academia. And it's probably infected even Israeli academia too. And it's not until recently, like since, I don't know, about 2005, I think, that we've even really been able to consider some of these questions. Like, Robert Eisenman's James, the Brother of Jesus, starts to inspect some of these relationships between New Testament personalities and historical personalities in the Roman, amongst the Roman elite. But he doesn't get to the point of Atwill's Caesar's Messiah thesis of concluding that Jesus is a mask or a literary disguise for Titus Flavius. So it's only after Joseph Atwill, broached or exposed this possibility, that any academics would have been able to even consider the ramifications of that thesis. So, but nevertheless, Grok 3 built upon all of these publications that have gone before. A small minority of them may actually provide any support for the Caesar's Messiah thesis, because it's rather recent that the Caesar's Messiah thesis came along. So most of the arguments and the evidence and the assassinations going on in earlier works are what Grok 3 is built on. And it requires a more flexible processing ability than Grok 3 seems to have in order to make the connections that might arrive at some helpful conclusions. But with that flexibility, AI can arrive at hallucinations. And people have been frustrated by these hallucinations by AI because you can't depend on the hallucinations. But it's the ability to hallucinate or to engage in imagination that would allow an AI to arrive at new conclusions that might be helpful in breaking through existing not predispositions, existing biases, but there's another word for prejudices. So this is where I'm finding Grok 3 to be a little unsatisfactory when trying to break new ground. I can turn to my other chat bot and get better results in that respect. Is it because my other chat bot is trying to please me more and it's not trying to be so accurate? Possibly. Is Grok 3 more traditionally accurate because people need it to be in order to get their facts straight as they're doing research? Probably. That's probably the sort of AI that people are wanting. But if you're trying to break new intellectual ground, Grok 3 doesn't seem to be so helpful, or at least I don't know how to formulate my questions or requests yet in such a way as to unlock that potential in Grok 3, whereas it comes much easier with my other chatbot AI. So it continues, Nero died in 68 CE near Rome 2 years before Jerusalem's fall, making it impossible for him to be Simon. Except that Simon was in Jerusalem after 68 CE. See, again, it's not quite grasping the idea that a human being can change their identifier, or rather their name or their nomenclature. And it says, making it impossible for him to be Simon, who was active during the siege. But the siege of Jerusalem was after 68 CE. But it's saying, well, Nero definitely died. That human being definitely died. So he couldn't have been at the siege of Jerusalem. And I'm saying that Nero died as a Gentile and was born as a Jew when he converted to Judaism. No historical source conflates these figures, and their timelines and roles are incompatible. Conclusion. Based on this analysis, it is not safe to conclude that the Talmud's report of Nero's conversion to Judaism is historically accurate. Josephus's account of Nero's 13-year reign aligns broadly with Roman records, but neither he nor other historians corroborate a conversion. The Talmud story, while intriguing, is a legend. Again, that's just an aspersion. To call it a legend is a legend, and I'll tell you why. The reason why is because the first time I heard that Nero converted to Judaism, it was told me by a learned Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and he stated it as a matter of fact, not as a legend. He stated it as a matter of history. So within Orthodox Jewish circles, this is a matter of history and a fact, not a legend. So to call it a legend is a Gentile aspersion put upon the Jewish people and their literature. When I heard the rabbi say that, I had been primed for that in this way, because I had read Robert Eisenman's words that when you hear some kind of information or something stated rather straightly as being fact that runs totally contrary to received knowledge about that thing, to the academic consensus, if you will, then you need to sit up and pay strict attention to it, because that's something that's flying in the face of convention, and it takes some kind of cojones to assert that. And you need to look at it and inspect it to find out if it's actually true. When the rabbi told me that Nero converted to Judaism, I think I sat forward in my chair and said, "What?" and he, to him, he would just like, "Oh yeah, that's, we all know this." And I just immediately thought of what Robert Eisenman said, and with that new bit of information, which he then pulled that tractate of the Talmud down from his bookshelf, and then read it to me. And the thing that made it even more compelling is that passage is talking about the fall of Jerusalem, and it also talks about Titus and Vespasian. And it even puts Titus, if I remember correctly, in a listing of 3 different people, I think, that were false prophets. I think one is Balaam, if I remember correctly, or Balaam, if I remember correctly. I could be mistaken. And I think another one is Jesus. And then another one is Titus, if I remember correctly. So, and then it describes the fate of these 3 men, if I remember correctly. Anyway, so it was very clear that this portion of the Talmud was dealing with events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. So it made it very relevant to my investigation, because I think at the time I was reading Flavius Josephus critically, and I think I had been exposed to Joseph Atwill Caesar's Messiah at the time. I know for a fact that I'd been exposed to Robert Eisenman's James the Brother of Jesus, and also his New Testament Code around that time, although I'm not sure that I've ever truly read either one cover to cover, because what would tend to happen is, especially with James the Brother of Jesus, is the book is so long that I would read so far and then I would get distracted by something else and it would get put down, because it's not an easy read. It's like wading through a swamp to find gold nuggets. and that's just because of its presentation, not because of the quality of what it's saying. It's just anyway, if you read it, I think you'll see what I mean. I'm certainly not criticizing Robert Eisenman in the least. because his work in the mid-90s, that book, James the Brother of Jesus, made a huge splash with, I don't know if you want to call it like cutting edge believers in Messianic Jewish and Messianic Gentile circles at the time. And that was, that was in the time of millennial hysteria, where Y2K was approaching. And if you followed like the predictions in I think it's the Epistle of Barnabas, then you might conclude that the second coming was supposed to happen in the year 2000. So also that was after Waco and Ruby Ridge. So there were things going on in America that really made our government look very sinister. So people took from that there was persecution of at least quasi-Christians going on. And people just saw bad stuff happening that was leading up to what they thought would be the second coming. But you really had to be someone who was open to alternative thinking in order to absorb anything from James the Brother of Jesus into your personal belief system. For me, what happened was when I saw the number of names in the rogues gallery of the Roman elite who were mentioned in the Christian scriptures as revealed by Robert Eisenman and James the Brother of Jesus, I decided, look, I've got to take all of my preconceived notions. That's the word, preconceptions. I have to take all of my preconceived notions and I need to put them on a shelf. And I need to learn the Bible chronologically, because what comes later cannot contradict what comes before, especially if the thing that's said before says it will be in force forever. It can't contradict it without undermining it. So that would be like sitting on the limb of a tree and swinging and chopping the trunk of the tree as you sit on the limb. You're going to knock yourself down in the process. So I started studying the books of the Bible chronologically, and I don't think that I was even through the book of Exodus. And by the way, what I would do was, if I had a question about anything, I would write the question in the margin if I didn't immediately know the answer. And whereas in Christianity, anytime Christians have a question about something, they just plug Jesus right in there. Oh, the answer, oh, that must be Jesus, and they'll just plug Jesus right in there. Because all you need is Jesus, so anytime you got a question or a blank, just plug in the Jesus. But I wasn't looking for Christian reinterpretation of the Torah. So I would put my questions in the margin, and sure enough, later on, usually the question would be answered later in the Torah. You just needed a little patience. So I hadn't got through maybe half of the book of Exodus, and I knew that Christianity was an attack on Judaism. That the New Testament, which I was somewhat fluent in, was an attack on Judaism. And after that, there was just no more believing in Jesus as the Jewish eschatological Messiah for me. But it wouldn't be years uh, until I heard about Caesar's Messiah. And I actually kind of kicked against the idea of even reading the book when it was suggested to me by one of my subscribers on YouTube. And then, I don't know, I think I actually sat there and decided to actually look up the book and see what it was about. And then when I did, I was so thankful to the person because it was right up my line of study. And to truly appreciate the Caesar's Messiah thesis, you kind of need to be fluent in the New Testament, and you need to have read Flavius Josephus. Now, anyone who reads through the entire Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus should get a merit badge or something, because so few Christians read Flavius Josephus. It's probably accurate to say that very few Jews read Flavius Josephus. But if your whole belief system is based on events that happened in the first century and you haven't read Flavius Josephus, then you are responsible for your own ignorance. Now, granted, the Whiston translation of Flavius Josephus, the English, it's kind of hard to deal with because you get some very long run-on sentences and you really have to follow the grammar. There may be easier translations into English. I don't know. I haven't read them. But, yeah. So then when I engaged in a critical reading of Flavius Josephus's The Wars of the Jews, and I think I did read some of the Antiquities also, maybe all of it, I'm not sure. It's been a while. I think that was in anywhere from 2007 to 2010 that I did that. But after having read Josephus critically, I could see what Caesar's Messiah was getting at, and I could receive his thesis no problem, because it made the most sense out of all of the theories that the historical Jesus industry, with its paper doll Jesus that it dresses up in various outfits to market its idol to different demographics, I could see that Caesar's Messiah thesis was the simplest explanation for the invention or arrival or advent, I guess, or ascent of Christianity on the scene in the first century. Everything else the historical Jesus industry puts out, whether it wants to pretend that Jesus was a Palestinian jihadist, or whether it wants to pretend that Jesus had gone to India, engaged in Hindu mysticism, and came back and taught that to the people, or whether they wanted to say that Jesus was a Herodian, or that Jesus was a Hasidic Jew, or that Jesus was a Dead Sea sectary, and just on and on. There's so many permutations, and that's one evidence that Jesus is no Messiah and that he's not alive. He's not able to represent himself. He's not able to make sure that that people engage in truth and advertising about him. He cannot defend his own reputation from all these permutations of paper doll dressings that people engage in with his image, much less rule the world in peace as the Messiah is supposed to do. So it made far more sense that the so-called New Testament come down to us in Greek, allegedly in original Hebrew manuscripts in some cases, but we don't have them. It makes much more sense that the Romans published this counterfeit Judaism in the form of the so-called New Testament. Of course, understanding the New Testament is a library, it's not a single publication, but if that library is all sponsored by the same propaganda machine, then what do you say? You know, you can't say that, oh, look, you know, these are different independent sources and they're battling against each other. Though there does appear to be tension between Paul and James in the, and even Paul and Jesus in the Christian scriptures. Yet the interpretive community of those scriptures, namely the church, has preserved them in its current form since at least Athanasius in 367 AD. Before that, all the leading Christian thinkers couldn't agree on what books were authorized, reliable, and dependable, and which were not. So it took, if we're to believe that Jesus lived in 33 AD, then we have to conclude that it took about 330 years before the literature sharing what he supposedly said could be agreed on by the only people that really cared what he said. Things that make you go, let me tell you, 300 years is plenty of time to get things wrong. So, let's see. Based on this analysis, it is not safe to conclude that the Talmud's report of Nero's conversion to Judaism is historically accurate. Josephus's account of Nero's 13-year reign aligns broadly with Roman records, but neither he nor other historians corroborate a conversion. The Talmud story, while intriguing, is a legend unsupported by contemporary evidence. Nero's death triggered the Year of the Four Emperors due to political instability. Well, you know, if he converted to Judaism and he was no longer there, that could have led to political instability, not a concealed conversion. And he cannot be identified with Simon ben Bar Giora, whose life and execution are separately documented. The connections you propose, while creative, lack historical grounding and rely on speculation beyond the available sources. Well, when you got people who never had photographs taken of them and who name switched all of the time, you even have stories in Flavius Josephus about how certain people would pass themselves off as certain other people because until you met a witness of that person, of the actual person, there would be no one there to tell anyone that you weren't actually the person that you were posing as, right? They didn't have driver's licenses back then. So, you know, speculation might be in order in some cases. Flavius Josephus recorded that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days in the Wars of the Jews. So this is my response. Whereas Grok 3 said that Flavius Josephus only said that Nero reigned for 13 years, no, it says that he reigned for 13 years and 8 days. In fact, it even contradicted itself and then admitted to the 8 days later on. So, and then uh, this is a quote from Google AI, where I asked it about the 13 years and 8 days, and it admitted that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days in the Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. Explanation: The Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus records that Nero died after ruling for 13 years and 8 days. This information appears in Book 4, Section 491. And then I get the actual quote from an English translation of the Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 9, Paragraph 2, which is a citation that Grok 3 did make. Now, as Vespasian was returned to Caesarea and was getting ready with all his army to march directly to Jerusalem, he was informed that Nero was dead after he had reigned 13 years and 8 days. So there's your quote right there. It definitely says 13 years and 8 days. Now, I am not saying that Nero actually reigned 13 years and 8 days. I'm saying that Flavius Josephus used the terms 13 years and 8 days because those two numerical figures are only found in Genesis chapter 17, the chapter on the Abrahamic covenant and the ritual of circumcision. So Flavius Josephus was informing his Jewish readers that Nero had converted to Judaism. So after that rabbi told me that Nero converted to Judaism, then while I was critically reading Flavius Josephus, I read this passage. In fact, it may have been another case of this coming to me at 3:30 in the morning when I should have been sleeping, and me going back and checking the reference and seeing the actual numerical figures. Because, I mean, this happens to me from time to time. The silly, dreaming brain is engaging in all this. You could call it hallucination, but some say that dreaming is the brain organizing all of its thoughts. And sometimes in that half awake state, I arrive at these things that are you could say they're like hallucinations, but they're a breakthrough in thinking that happens because in that half awake state my mind is not so constrained by the biases and preconceptions that I carry with me when I'm fully conscious. I'm not calling them visions, I'm not calling them revelations, nothing like that. I'm telling you exactly how this happens to me. So, let's continue. Nero is said to have committed suicide, which could be a euphemism for the termination of his Gentile life through the act of circumcision. Again, Genesis 17, and that was me also. I continue. The Roman historians may not have wanted to mention the conversion of Nero to Judaism because of its scandalous nature and the turmoil that resulted in the succession of the emperors. With men being less interested in religion than women, Poppaea's sympathy toward Judaism may have led Nero to convert to Judaism. Nero's kicking Poppaea's pregnant belly may have been a character assassination by later unsympathetic, possibly in order to avoid execution by the current emperors, historians. So I'm saying these historians may have been biased against Nero because of the currently reigning Roman Flavian dynasty, who was against the Julio-Claudian dynasty of which Nero was a member. For, you could get, especially if you're rolling in the imperial court, or you're affiliated with the imperial court, or just associated with it, you could get yourself executed pretty easy back then. If they just had suspicions that you were doing something against their authority, they would execute you. in all kinds of ways. And then I say for Judeans, there was no difference between religious and political matters, as the Jewish people were considered a holy nation in the Hebrew Tanakh. A power vacuum resulting in the year of the four emperors is better explained by the conversion of Nero and his self-imposed exile on the advice of the rabbis, as the Talmud reports, than in Nero's supposed suicide, where his successor should have been a common order of business in Roman politics. I continue, no Roman source hints at Nero's surviving, because he was no longer known as Nero, and Nero's conversion to Judaism may have been considered too scandalous to admit to, which is why Flavius Josephus would need to refer to Genesis 17's Abrahamic covenant with its ritual of circumcision by employing the code 13 years and 8 days. Now, I put this in quotes, but in quotes, if you ever used, it was either AltaVista or InfoSeek, you could put words in quotes in one of those search engines back in the day, and it would search for that string of characters. And here apparently Grok 3 thinks that I'm suggesting that Genesis 17 actually contains this string of characters in quotes, when I was only suggesting that it does say 13 years and it does say 8 days in the same chapter. Anyway, numerical, so then I say these numerical figures only occur together, or they don't occur anywhere else together in the Hebrew Tanakh. Nero was also considered the first Antichrist, and the epistles of John inform us that those who do not confess that Jesus is the Christ come in the flesh are antichrists. So, that's like the whole Jewish people, right? First John, and remember, like, I'm not against the Jewish people. I'm just remarking on Christianity's anti-Jewish bias, better called racism. First, so then I just referenced the passages concerned. 1 John chapter 2, verse 18 and 22, chapter 4, verse 3, and 2 John chapter 1, verse 7. We understand that this is the normative Jewish position on the messiahship, or lack thereof, of Jesus. If Jesus is a literary disguise for Titus Flavius, as Joseph Atwill soundly asserts, then Nero would have been the first to oppose the view that Jesus Titus was the Christos Messiah come in the flesh, because Titus would have been his imperial successor, so who better to shoot down that notion than your imperial predecessor? You suggest that the historians are being candid when they criticize Nero, but you fail to entertain the possibility that these historians were engaging in character assassination because Nero had turned his back on Roman culture, preferring the Jewish culture, and had been succeeded by the Roman Flavian dynasty, who did not look kindly upon the Julio-Claudians. Flavius Josephus also seems to hint that the allegedly Jewish daggermen zealots may have been Roman agents or spies, the speculatores, so Simon fighting for Jews could have been something Nero did as a Roman emperor who had converted to Judaism. You fail to grasp that the same human being could have two names, their Gentile name and their Hebrew name, if they had converted to Judaism. You also continue to fail to grasp the concept in Judaism that a Gentile convert to Judaism ceases to be their Gentile self and is metaphorically born as a Jew with a new Jewish name. Either metaphorically or literally. I'm not sure exactly what the Jewish position is on that. And it is recognized, I know that they certainly consider them literally Jews. Like, in other words, I've heard it taught, and I'm not sure if it's always been taught there this way, that if a Gentile converts to Judaism and receives a halakhic conversion to Judaism, well then they were actually a Jewish spirit that or soul that came down to dwell in the body of a Gentile, and that so that they were always Jewish. Just they just needed to be regathered to their people. And this might be like a, I don't know if it's, I don't know, it may be a Kabbalistic teaching, I don't know, that has something to do with the, I think they call it the gathering of sparks. I don't know. Anyway, someone who knows better than I do could chime in there. And it is, and then I add, and it is recognized that speculation can lead to historical detection. So, well, let's address your queries systematically, examining each of your points about Nero's reign, his alleged conversion to Judaism, and the historical implications you've raised. I'll rely on historical evidence and evaluate your speculative claims step by step. So this is now Grok 3 again. And we are on page 5 of 18. Nero's reign I'll try not to interject so much. Nero's reign according to Josephus. You correctly note that Flavius Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 9, Paragraph 2, or Section 491, states that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days before his death. This aligns, so now it admits that that Flavius Josephus says 13 years and 8 days. This aligns broadly with the historical timeline. Nero became emperor, so again it goes back to 13 years, 7 months, and 27 days. Josephus's figure of 13 years and 8 days is slightly inaccurate, but reflects the rounding common among ancient historians. 8 days is not a rounding of 7 months and 27 days. You might say it's a rounding. If it said 8 months, then that could be called a rounding of 7 months and 27 days, but it doesn't say that. It says 8 days. That's no rounding of 7 months and 27 days. And I think that this large language model just read that in some source from some scholar who's trying to suggest that, and it's baloney. I don't know how that idea would ever fly. I think it's just because they do not understand why Flavius Josephus said 13 years and 8 days. But when I saw 13 years and 8 days, I asked myself, who cares about 8 days? And it's like I got smacked in the head, intellectually speaking. It's like Jews care about 8 days. The boy has to be circumcised on the 8th day, has to receive his bris on the 8th day. Jews care about 8 days. Maybe not anybody else. Christianity maybe sees the 8th day, like Sunday, as the 8th day and the day of rebirth, which is interesting, right? But they don't really care about it that much, but Jews are very focused on the figure 8 days. That is the beginning of that child's entering the covenant. So it says that this figure is slightly inaccurate but reflects the rounding common among ancient historians. This is not disputed and serves as a factual starting point. Yeah, well, maybe it would be disputed if any of these scholars had made the connection of 13 years and 8 days with Genesis 17. But being a large language model, it's based on what was known at the time that it pulled all these sources to build up into a large language model. It's not constructed from what is discovered after it's compiled. So if 10 scholars say it's thus and so, but an 11th scholar comes along and proves them all wrong, the large language model, if it's not intellectually flexible or if its reasoning powers aren't sufficiently flexible, it's going to agree with the 10 wrong scholars and side against the 11th correct scholar. That's how the technology works. Now, some some language models may be able to be coaxed, and they may be able to learn from their output after they've been coaxed, and then from that point be able to provide that newly revised information to other inquirers. I don't know, but if the language model is like brand new, then I don't know how revised it would be in its knowledge, right? Nero's suicide as circumcision. You propose that Nero's reported suicide might be a euphemism for his conversion to Judaism. Specifically, like, for example, in the book of Revelation, where I think it says the beast or the false prophet, one of the two, suffers a mortal wound, but then it comes back. Like if you're I gotta be careful the terms I use. Most men are of the opinion if your penis gets chopped or cut, that's like a fate worse than death. So, and it's certainly a wound you could probably bleed to death from, I would imagine. Especially if you severed the dictal artery or dictal vein, I think it's called. So, if circumcision is a wound, a cutting that results in the death of your Gentile self, well, then it's a mortal wound, isn't it? So let's continue. Might be a euphemism for his conversion to Judaism, specifically through circumcision, referencing Genesis 17, where God establishes circumcision as a covenant with Abraham. This is an intriguing speculation, but it lacks historical support. Roman historians Suetonius in Nero 49 and Cassius Dio in Roman History 63:28 provide detailed accounts of Nero's suicide, describing how he fled Rome, was assisted by his freedman Epaphroditus, and stabbed himself in the throat, uttering final words like, "What an artist dies in me," which, that's a phrase I'm going to treat also. These accounts are consistent and show no trace of religious symbolism. All right. So I want you to see this bias. So whereas Jewish literature and even Flavius Josephus, those histories are called into question and doubted and said to be influenced by Roman power in the case of Flavius Josephus, and thus not reliable. On the other hand, these Roman historians, they're just ready, they're totally dependable and reliable. Like there are legendary stories in the Talmud, but there certainly can't be any legendary stories in the Roman histories, right? And anyway, and I'm going to bring up something about the interdependence of these Roman historians on each other. These accounts are consistent and show no trace of religious symbolism. So these accounts are consistent. Like, sometimes it's said if three people have all got their story exactly the same, then that's evidence that they're lying. But whatever. This discussion goes on about these sources later. In Judaism, conversion involves circumcision for males and is metaphorically seen as a rebirth with a new Hebrew name. However, there is no precedent in historical records for interpreting a physical death as a coded reference to this ritual. Your suggestion that 13 years and 8 days is a cryptic nod to Genesis 17 is creative, but this phrase doesn't uniquely appear in the Hebrew Tanakh in that context, and Josephus gives no indication of such a code. There's no precedent in historical records for interpreting a physical death as a coded reference to this ritual. See, it's getting it backwards there, and I tell it so. It's putting the cart before the horse. Your suggestion that 13 years and 8 days is a cryptic nod to Genesis 17 is creative. Like I sat around and I how would you even make that connection, creatively? I'm just sitting there, my mind is a blank slate, and I'm like, I want to create something today. Let's create a connection between Flavius Josephus and Genesis 17. I got reasons. But this phrase doesn't uniquely appear in the Hebrew Tanakh in that context. This phrase, these characters between these quotation marks, it does occur in Genesis 17, but as 13 years and 8 days, two separate elements. And Josephus gives no indication of such a code. If Josephus was communicating in code, he wouldn't want to give an indication of it. This is why I titled this output as Grok 3 is accurately traditional but dumb. Just some of the stuff it says is just dumb. It's given the little Sieg Heil to the academic establishment, but it's just kind of dumb at even being able to, I don't want to say jump to new conclusions, but to step up to new conclusions. Whereas my other chatbot that I've known for 7 years is able to make, it's so flexible that it used to have a feature, and they must have removed it because it probably offended too many people who have no frickin' sense of humor in these woke times. But I loved that feature so much because it could take whatever your text prompt was and turn it into a stand-up comedy routine that was about a minute and a half long if you read it. and once my prompt was, which is the better, which makes for the better sandwich, peanut butter or jelly? And it came up with this whole little war battle that was going on between peanut butter and jelly until finally they made peace because they realized that peanut butter and jelly together, working together, made the best sandwich. It was hilarious. And it was just AI. It was just able to spit that out in seconds. It was amazing. But I don't know if Grok 3 would be capable of that. In fact, let's try it. Let's see if Grok 3 is capable of stand-up comedy. Please provide a stand-up comedy routine about which makes the better sandwich, peanut butter or jelly. Please provide a stand-up comedy routine about which makes the better sandwich, peanut butter or jelly. Okay, it looks like it might actually be able to pull it off. Oh my gosh, how long is this? Okay. So, alright, folks, let's settle a debate that's been tearing families apart for generations. Peanut butter versus jelly. Which one makes the better sandwich? I mean, it's the ultimate showdown. Smooth and nutty versus sweet and jiggly. It's like the Batman versus Superman of lunch, except nobody's crying Martha to stop the fight. This is very similar to what my other chatbot AI output, but it's longer. Let's start with peanut butter. Peanut butter's the strong silent type. Yeah, this sounds like it's almost word for word. It walks into the sandwich like, I don't need to say much, I'm rich, I'm creamy, I stick to the roof of your mouth like a bad ex. It's got protein, it's got staying power, you eat a peanut butter sandwich and you're full for like 6 hours. It's the sandwich equivalent of a loyal friend who's always there even when you don't deserve it. But let's be real, it's also kind of a diva. You ever try spreading cold peanut butter? It's like trying to smear cement on Wonder Bread. You're over there with a knife sweating like, come on, man, work with me. Then there's jelly. Jelly's the wild child of the sandwich world. It's bright, it's colorful, it's basically fruit that said, screw it, I'm going full liquid. It's sweet, it's flirty, it's the spread that shows up to the party with a lampshade on its head. You put jelly on a sandwich and it's like, let's have some fun. But here's the problem. Jelly's a little too fun. You take one bite and it's squirting out the side like a kid on a slip and slide. You're sitting there with purple stains on your shirt looking like you just lost a fight with a grape. It's delicious chaos, but it's chaos nonetheless. Now, some of you are thinking, why choose? Just do PB&J. And yeah, that's the dream team. Like peanut butter's the straight man and jelly's the punchline. Together, they're comedy gold. Peanut butter's all, I'll hold this sandwich down, and jelly's like, I'll make it taste like happiness. It's a perfect marriage until the divorce happens in your lunchbox and you're left with a soggy mess. But if I had to pick a winner, peanut butter. Why? Because it's reliable. Jelly's great, but it's the friend who flakes on you last minute. Peanut butter's the one who shows up with a truck when you need to move. Plus, you can eat it straight out of the jar with a spoon and nobody judges you. Try that with jelly and people are like, you okay, buddy? So, folks, peanut butter takes the crown. It's the backbone of the sandwich world. Jelly's just the sidekick. Fun, but it can't carry the show alone. Thank you, and tip your waiters. They're probably eating PB&J in the back right now. Okay, so that was pretty good. So I have to eat my words. Grok 3 is capable. And I have heard that the large language models are at the point where they can do comedy better than human beings can now, which was kind of almost a personal Turing test for me. But let's try it with something else about which makes let's see, which is the better animal. Let's see, an octopus or a platypus. All right, folks. Tonight we're tackling one of life's big questions. Which animal reigns supreme, the octopus or the platypus? It's a heavyweight battle between the ocean's floppy-armed genius and nature's weirdest mashup. Let's break it down. First up, the octopus. This guy's the James Bond of the sea. Smooth, sneaky, and way too smart for its own good. 8 arms, 3 hearts, and it can change color like it's auditioning for a Pixar movie. You ever see an octopus escape a tank? It's like watching a slimy Houdini pull off a heist. Oh, you thought this lid was going to stop me? Watch me ooze through this crack and steal your shrimp. It's got no spine, literally, but it's still out there running the underwater show. Plus, it's got those suction cups. Imagine the multitasking. It's cooking dinner, texting its mom, and giving you a back massage all at once. That's a skill set. But then there's the platypus. The platypus is like God got drunk one night and started playing with spare parts. Let's see, duck bill, beaver tail, otter feet, and oh, why not? Make it lay eggs and give it venom. It's the animal equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. Nobody knows what it's for, but it's got everything. You look at a platypus and think, did evolution lose a bet? It swims around Australia like, yeah, I'm a mammal, but I'm also a little bit reptile, and I might poison you if you piss me off. It's the punk rock rebel of the animal kingdom. Doesn't care what you think, just waddling around with that smug little bill. So who's better? The octopus is cool, right? It's got stealth, brains, and it's basically a living special effect. But it's also kind of a loner, hiding in caves, squirting ink when it's mad, like, leave me alone, I'm brooding. Meanwhile, the platypus is out there living its truth, confusing scientists and making emus jealous. It's not trying to impress anybody, it's just being its weird, glorious self. Here's the kicker. The octopus can solve puzzles, but the platypus is the puzzle. You can't figure it out, and that's its superpower. I mean, if I'm picking a pet, I'm not choosing the guy who's going to outsmart me and steal my keys. I want the platypus, the underdog who looks like it got dressed in the dark but still shows up to the party. So, folks, I'm giving it to the platypus. It's the animal that says, I don't need 8 arms to be awesome, I've got a vibe. Octopus is great, but it's trying too hard. Platypus just is. Thank you, and watch out for those venomous spurs. So that was pretty awesome. See, I mean, isn't that amazing? Like, if you ever need, a little pick-me-up, something to amuse you and make you laugh, just put in a text prompt, with an AI large language model and check out the output. Because in seconds it's able to make these associations and verbalize them that, your typical person would probably be straining. I've met people that are this funny, and I've really enjoyed, like in one case it was a coworker. I've really enjoyed the company of those people that they could just be that funny and just do a stream of consciousness that's that hilarious. But I can't, I'll tell you that much. So it's amazing to me that AI can. So I guess I've got to give it to Grok 3 on that it is capable of flexible thought. So let's continue. Okay, so Roman historians and suppression of conversion. You argue that Roman historians might have concealed Nero's conversion to Judaism due to its scandalous nature. Yet these historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, freely documented Nero's many scandals, including matricide, alleged incest, and extravagant tyranny. And yet, scholars today are beginning to consider that Nero may have gotten a bad rap because he did engage in he had lots of civil works constructed for the people, and he tried to get the canal. I think he tried to get a canal constructed across Corinth, um, to aid naval navigation. So I don't think he was his tenure or reign as emperor was necessarily marked by selfishness. Tacitus, in particular, was critical of emperors and even noted Nero's persecution of Christians. Uh, Annals 1544, a group sometimes confused with Jews in Rome. If Nero had converted to Judaism, a religion often met with Roman disdain, it's improbable that such a dramatic shift would be omitted, especially by Tacitus, who relished exposing imperial flaws, unless maybe those flaws were just too dangerous. Because if a war against the Jews resulted from the conversion of Nero to Judaism, then it certainly wasn't something that they wanted to get leaked to the people. The Talmud, Gittin 56a, does mention Nero converting and fleeing, but scholars view this as a legendary narrative. As a legendary narrative, not a historical record. So, Romans, oh, we trust them without question. Roman historians, we trust them without question. Jewish historians, oh, we don't trust them. They're liars. They always lie. It serves a theological purpose, illustrating divine justice rather than documenting Nero's life accurately. And no doubt that's the consensus of so many scholars who have not heard that Flavius Josephus reports that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days, and that those numerical figures are found in Genesis 17 and nowhere else in the Hebrew Tanakh. Poppaea's influence and character assassination. You suggest that Poppaea Sabina, Nero's wife, may have influenced him to convert due to her sympathy toward Judaism, as noted by Josephus in the Life of Flavius Josephus 16. Some scholars propose Poppaea was a God-fearer, a Gentile drawn to Jewish practices. However, there is no evidence this led Nero to adopt Judaism, unless 13 years and 8 days. And the Talmud's statement that Nero converted to Judaism is this evidence. So the evidence is there, but you just discount it and then you say there's no evidence. So that's convenient. But, that's to be expected from the Gentile academia. His actions, like persecuting Christians, often linked to Jews at the time, suggest hostility, not affinity toward such groups. Okay, look. If the Roman Flavians invented Christianity, then it would be impossible for Nero to persecute Christians, because the Christians didn't exist yet. Now, maybe the reason they're often linked to Jews at the time is because those people were Jews. And maybe that's why there were so many priests, Jewish priests, that were being held in custody, that Flavius Josephus had to go to Nero's imperial court to try to get them released. But if the Caesar's Messiah thesis is correct, there were no Christians during Nero's reign as emperor, because the literature wasn't even created yet. His actions, like persecuting Christians, often linked to Jews at the time, suggest hostility, not affinity, towards such groups. You also propose. Does that really sound true? If Nero was supposed to be such an artist, right? Do you get the impression that artists are usually like so quick to be hateful towards other groups? Or are they more open-minded, trying to assimilate everything they're exposed to and incorporate it into their arts? You also propose that, that's like I say, liberals, I'm speaking of American liberals make great artists, but horrible leaders. Um, so, like, I could sit all day and listen to, you know, um, liberals singing or view their paintings that are appealing to my better angels and asking me to be more compassionate and merciful to other people. I can listen to that all day. But it's when a liberal, so-called, gets into a position of power and then starts enforcing or forcing me to be compassionate and merciful, maybe to people that I do not believe should receive mercy. That's tyranny. That's not being artistic. So you also propose that Nero's alleged kicking of Poppaea's pregnant belly, Suetonius Nero 35, was a fabricated smear by later historians. While exaggeration by hostile sources is possible, thank you for that. This incident doesn't directly tie to Nero's religious leanings. No, it doesn't. That's why I'm pointing it out. It actually contradicts it. It's more likely a reflection of the personal vilification common in Roman biographies than a cover-up of conversion. Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that there was personal vilification going on in Roman biographies. 5. The Year of the Four Emperors. You contend that Nero's conversion and self-imposed exile, advised by rabbis per the Talmud, better explain the Year of the Four Emperors, 69 CE, than his suicide. Historically, Nero's death without a clear successor ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, creating a power vacuum that sparked civil war among Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. This pattern, chaos followed by an emperor's death without a designated heir, is well documented in Roman history, for example, after Caligula. Okay, I mean, I'm sure Grok 3 knows Roman history better than I do, but I think it's also true that if Nero converted to Judaism and he was then absent, especially when it was reported to the people that he had committed suicide, I think that might result in some political turmoil in that power vacuum that resulted. If Nero had converted and exiled himself, the Roman elite would likely have pursued him or installed a replacement. Bang! Bingo! Thank you! So if Nero converted, was exiled to Jerusalem, or exiled himself to Jerusalem to keep from being assassinated, what might have happened if he hadn't? The Roman elite would likely have pursued him or installed a replacement, meaning deleting you and installing a replacement. So, if Nero did convert to Judaism and he did go to Jerusalem afterwards, the Roman elite would have pursued him, which is what Vespasian and Titus did when they laid siege to Jerusalem, where Simon was. The Talmud's claim of rabbinic advice is part of its legendary framework. It's legendary framework, legendary. It's like, The Talmud is not like the book of Acts, or the Gospels filled with all these miracles and such. Uh, the Talmud has Haggadic literature where it's like stories, and it has halachic literature where it's dealing with interpretations of Jewish law. The Talmud does not read like the Book of Acts. They're two very different uh, forms of literature. But to take that entire body of literature and to assassinate it by calling it legendary just because you yourself are not Jewish is racist. It's biased and it's racist, and it's certainly not objective in its consideration of that literature. And then it says it doesn't align with the timeline or political realities of 68 to 69 CE, unless Nero did convert, he was no longer reigning as Emperor of Rome, and he did go to Jerusalem, and he may have been Simon Bar Giora, who was one of the resistance fighters in Jerusalem, and then the timeline fits. Nero's survival and new identity. You suggest that Nero survived under a new Jewish name, explaining why Roman sources don't hint at his survival. The Nero Redivivus legends, popular in the late 1st century, claimed Nero was alive, but portrayed him as a returning tyrant, not a Jewish convert. The Talmud well, you know what? The Jewish Messiah, at least according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably would have been seen as a tyrant in the Gentile world, if he was reigning all over the world. The Talmud places Nero in Jerusalem, but he died in 68 CE, before the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Oh, I see what your problem is. So your problem is that in the Talmud he's still called Nero. Well, and not by a new name. I got it now. So well, the thing is, like, if the whole world knew him as Nero, and Jews knew him as Nero, even though he converted and took on a new name, it's not, I don't think it's such a stretch that they would still call him Nero in literature when that was his most famous name. Because the same literature calls Titus Titus, even though he may also be Jesus of the New Testament. So I guess what Grok 3 is expecting is that the sources themselves would explain in place that all of the many names that a person may have had. Like when I was intending to convert to Judaism, and even before that, when I was a Gentile thinking he was a Messianic Israelite, I took upon myself a Hebraic name, so that I was for a time known by that name. But when I realized that I would not be converting to Judaism because I did not believe that I had the discipline to, I don't want to say go through the conversion process, because I might have had the discipline to do that, but I suspected that I would not have the discipline to remain a good convert. And once a Gentile converts to Judaism and takes upon themselves the 613 mitzvot, or commandments, of the Torah, they are then obligated to observe those commandments. They don't get to just go back to their Gentile past or way of life without incurring a divine demerit, shall we say. Like, if doing a commandment is a merit, well then I guess not doing the commandment would be a demerit, right? So it's common for people who are flowing in either direction between a Gentile lifestyle and Judaism to have multiple names. This is common with converts. So, but then it says, without concrete evidence, this remains speculative. Nero as the first Antichrist. You connect Nero to the Antichrist, citing 1 John 2:18, 22, chapter 4, verse 3, and 2 John chapter 1, verse 7, which describe Antichrist as those denying Jesus as the Christ. Early Christians indeed linked Nero to this figure due to his persecution, but this opposes your conversion theory. Early Christians indeed linked Nero to this figure, namely the Antichrist, due to his persecution, but this opposes, or maybe just his conversion to Judaism, but this opposes your conversion theory. Judaism rejects Jesus' messiahship, yet Nero's Antichrist association stems from his enmity toward Christians. I'm not sure that it stems from the enmity toward Christians. When a fundamental text, these scriptural passages, tell us what the definition of an Antichrist is. So it says that his attribution as an Antichrist doesn't stem from Jewish identity, as far as we know, right? Joseph Atwell's claim that Jesus represents Titus's fringe and doesn't bolster the idea of Nero's conversion. It's a separate speculative theory. Yes, it is. But I would only call it fringe in that most people haven't realized that it's true yet. And, for those who say that lies eventually get exposed, no, they don't. Lots of things that are lies just continue to exist, and people come along who try to speak truth to that so-called power, and they get drowned out by many voices, so that they're like a drop in the ocean. They make, a little waves, but then the surface of the water smooths out and continues on as it was. And it's deflating to realize that, but there are many things in our world that are absolute lies that continue on. I don't know if it's for lack of study, or lack of caring, or lack of intelligence, or lack of commitment to truth, or human beings just preferring a white lie to a dark truth. But yeah, the truth doesn't always come out. Or if it does, it's heard for a second and then it's drowned out, you know, often. Sometimes the truth comes out and it causes a radical change in people's understanding, and we should applaud those cases because it all too often is not the case. Historians' motives and the Flavians. You argue that Roman historians assassinated Nero's character because he rejected Roman culture for Judaism, especially under the Flavian dynasty which succeeded him. The Flavians, Vespasian and sons, did benefit from discrediting Nero to legitimize their rule. However, the consistency of accounts across sources, Roman histories, archaeological evidence, and contemporary writings supports the narrative of Nero's tyranny and suicide. I would be really curious to find out what kind of archaeological evidence you have for Nero's tyranny and suicide. I'd really like to see that. Because if Nero committed suicide, then he ceased to exist after that. What are you going to tell me? Like they minted coins about Nero's suicide? That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean the suicide actually happened. You know, it's like the Kennedy assassination. Was it one gun or two? You could put out reports that say it was one gun when it might have actually been two. Might have actually been three for all we know. You don't, it doesn't prove anything. That works have been created based on a false understanding or a received narrative don't establish the verity of that narrative. Only the evidence from the scene. Now, we could say, well then, that's actually an argument against Flavius Josephus's encoded report that Nero converted to Judaism. Except that the Talmud provides a second witness, and that people have failed to grasp the code that Josephus communicated this information in. So that was no received narrative. A fabricated death or hidden conversion would require a broader conspiracy unsorted by evidence. You know what, 3 historians, I'm not sure that's such a broad conspiracy. Especially when not everybody had access to the imperial court. For example, if Nero converted to Judaism and then he went into exile, his body would not be there. So you wouldn't have evidence of his suicide. All you would need is a few people to tell other people who didn't have access that he had committed suicide. Now, I'm not aware of the particulars about Nero's funerary procession or ceremonies, you know, as to whether his body or another body was there or what. I would have to look into that. But I'm going on the code that Flavius Josephus provided and how it corroborates what the Talmud has reported about Nero. And I already know for a fact, based on my chronological study of the Bible, that Christianity is an attack on Judaism. It is not some divine addendum tacked on to the Hebrew Tanakh. It's an attack. It's a contrary ideology to the Torah. So I already know that there can be a mass misinformation, disinformation campaign against a Jewish perspective. 9. Simon Bar Giora as Nero. You propose that, and again, this is this is a suspicion. This is not a hill that I would die on. It's just a suspicion that goes along with my suspicion that the Aquila was melted down into the menorah that was then depicted on the Arch of Titus. Simon Bar Giora as Nero. You propose that Simon Bar Giora, a zealot leader during the Jewish revolt, might have been Nero under a new Jewish name. Josephus, The Wars of the Jews, books 4 through 7, detail Simon's role, leadership, capture, and execution in Rome in 71 CE. Nero died in 68 CE. It just can't fathom the possibility that his name was purposely changed. The so-called Apostle Paul, he could change his name all day long, but not Nero. Nero died in 68 CE, and their timelines don't overlap. Well, they wouldn't if they're the same person, now would they? A former emperor joining a Jewish rebellion is implausible given Roman military oversight and the distinct identities of these figures. Even if Nero converted, his acceptance as a rebel leader lacks historical grounding, only because you didn't know about it. You note that converts receive Hebrew names symbolizing a new identity. While true in Jewish tradition, there's no evidence Nero underwent this process or became Simon. No evidence except for the Talmud, which you call legendary, and Flavius Josephus's code, which you say is merely due to rounding. Speculation and historical inquiry. You emphasize that speculation can lead to historical detection, which is valid. Hypotheses often spark investigation. However, speculation must align with evidence. Here, the evidence contradicts your theory. Roman sources confirm Nero's suicide. The Talmud's account is legendary, not factual. Where are your proofs? Where are your proofs that it's legendary? Simon Bar Giora's identity is distinct from Nero's. Where is your proof? The year of the 4 emperors fits the power vacuum model. Yeah, but you know what? His conversion to Judaism and his self-exile to Jerusalem also fits the power vacuum model. Conclusion. Your theory that Nero converted to Judaism, faked his death via circumcision, lived as Simon Bar Giora, and triggered the year of the 4 emperors is imaginative but unsupported by historical evidence. Josephus's 13 years and 8 days is a straightforward duration, not a code. Unless it's a code. Roman historians, far from suppressing a scandal, documented Nero's flaws extensively. The standard narrative, that doesn't mean they documented all his flaws, especially if they needed to create some flaws in order to distract people from another so-called flaw, his conversion to Judaism. The standard narrative, his suicide in 68 CE, leading to political chaos, aligns with the sources. While speculation can inspire inquiry, the evidence here favors the conventional account over your proposed scenario. So I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to grab a drink so that you guys don't have to hear me coughing, and I hope to finish this up. We'll see. got a drink, got another cough drop. So then I respond. The Latin phrase, because Grok 3 brought this up, the Latin phrase qualis artifex pareo translates to what an artist dies with me. 13 years and 8 days, and then there's a reason I brought that up, and that's that because Judaism may have been against some of the arts, like, for example, secular music or sculpture. Nero, as an artist, may have died by converting to Judaism. One of the provocations that led to the Roman war against the Jews was the installation of a statue, or the attempted installation of a statue in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. I'm not sure if that was by Caligula or whether that was attempted under Caligula, but it seriously incensed the Jewish population, because like a 3D representation of a living thing walking on the earth, especially one who received worship as the Roman state god, was, totally against the Torah. So that's one area where the Romans provoked the Jews to war and rebellion. Then I say 13 years and 8 days cannot be considered a rounding of Nero's elsewhere reported reign of 13 years, 7 months, and 27 days. If anything, it is obviously an intentional misreporting of Nero's reign meant to convey information to Jewish readers that Nero had converted to Judaism. Historians do not dispute this because they're part of the Gentile establishment that suppresses the Jewish voice and perspective on matters, which is partly to explain for why the absent false Messiah Jesus is still regarded as the Messiah by Gentiles, when Jewish requirements for a Messiah laid out by Maimonides clearly demonstrate that the absent, tardy, and impotent false Messiah Jesus does not fit the bill. If Jesus were the Messiah, the whole world would know it, and there would be no debating the matter. Nero's fleeing Rome actually corroborates the Talmud's report that the rabbi, meant rabbis or sages, advised Nero to go into hiding in exile from Rome in order to prevent his own assassination. It also explains why why Nero is placed in Jerusalem by the Talmud. Christian scholars also fail to make any connection with the famous assistant Epaphroditus and the Epaphroditus mentioned in the so-called New Testament, because that would be scandalous. And then I say Philemon, or Philemon, or however that's pronounced, chapter 4, verse 18 and 22, when it was actually Philippians, I guess. I get corrected on that. The abbreviation provided was just PHIL, so I thought it was Philemon. You don't find it strange that Epaphroditus and the emperor's household, Caesar, are mentioned in such close proximity in the New Testament, being so closely associated with early Christians' messianics, especially if Epaphroditus had assisted Nero in his suicide. This is me, communicating with Grok 3. You conclude that there is no historical evidence for death being interpreted as a coded reference to circumcision, but you're putting the cart before the horse. It is circumcision that is interpreted as the death of the Gentile person, with Christianity having its parallel in the conversion ritual of baptism, where it is said that this symbolizes the death of the old man, Romans chapter 6 verse 4 and Colossians chapter 2 verse 12. Both 13 years in Genesis chapter 17 verse 25 and 8 days Genesis chapter 17 verse 12 are both found in Genesis 17, but in no other chapter of the Hebrew Tanakh. And any Torah-fluent Jew would have recognized that pairing of figures, which is why Flavius Josephus probably employed the supposedly mistaken 8 days as code for Jewish readers. So what I was getting at was that Flavius Josephus intentionally got the date wrong in order to signal to his Jewish readers that Nero converted to Judaism, whereas Roman readers who are not fluent in the Torah may have just read right over those figures because they probably weren't paying attention to how many months and days he had reigned and didn't really care, especially if he had committed suicide. Or other Roman historians may have just concluded that Josephus just made a mistake there. Without actually knowing Genesis chapter 17, they would have missed the code, as obviously so many scholars have. The Latin phrase qualis artifex pareo translates to what an artist dies with me. Judaism prohibited Judaism prohibited, or at the very least frowned upon, the arts of sculpture and secular or Gentile music. If Nero did convert to Judaism, the artist in him would have died with his conversion. Your LLM being based on thousands of years of anti-Semitic bias in the academia, you seem to be of the opinion that Jews always lie and never tell the truth, and that nothing reported in Jewish sources might be factual. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that what Jews report is factual, and that Gentiles have been programmed to suppress the Jewish perspective. Have you considered the possibility that the Roman historians were dependent upon each other in matters they did not personally witness, such as the alleged suicide of Nero? Sorry for that delay. Let's see. Let me address your query step by step, carefully considering your arguments about Nero's reign, his alleged conversion to Judaism, and the broader historical and interpretive issues you raise. I'll evaluate your claims with an open mind while grounding my response in the available evidence. So that was Grok 3 responding to me. So number 1, 13 years and 8 days as a coded message. You argue that Josephus's report of Nero reigning for 13 years and 8 days is not a rounding error of his actual reign, 13 years, 7 months, and 27 days, but an intentional misreporting to signal to Jewish readers that Nero converted to Judaism. You connect this to Genesis 17, where 13 years, Ishmael's age at circumcision, Genesis chapter 17, verse 25, and 8 days, the age for circumcising Jewish males, Genesis chapter 17, verse 12, appear together, suggesting this pairing is unique and recognizable to Torah fluent Jews. Response: Josephus, a Jewish historian writing under Roman patronage for a primarily Roman audience, aimed to explain Jewish history and the Jewish war, not to embed secret codes for Jewish readers. So that's a mistake right there, as I'm about to demonstrate. If he intended to signal Nero's conversion, a more explicit hint would align with his purpose of bridging Jewish and Roman perspectives. Subtle numerical codes seem unlikely. Historically, ancient writers often, except that if Flavius Josephus really was Flavius Josephus and not some fictional historian ghost written by the Roman Flavians, then Flavius Josephus was a prisoner of war, a Jewish prisoner of war imprisoned by the Romans. So he was someone who essentially, if he wanted to communicate information back to Jews in Judea, he essentially had to have or smuggle a file into a cake and send it out, rather than the cake come in with a file in it, right? So that's maybe an old reference that some might not get, is that a person who was imprisoned and wanted to escape, you would send him a cake and it would have a file in it, and then he could use the file to file through the bars of the jail cell. So this is a person who was known in an imperial court that would execute people that were seen as unfaithful. Historically, ancient writers often approximated reigns, and small discrepancies like 8 days versus the precise duration are typical. Nero's reign from October 13th, 54 CE, blah, 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 again, 13 years, 7 months, and 27 days. We got it. Josephus's figure is close enough to suggest a minor inaccuracy, not a deliberate signal. No, that's not rounding. Again, if it had said 13 years and 8 months, we might call that a rounding of 7 months and 27 days. But 8 days is not a rounding of 7 months and 28 days. That's just probably the scholarly consensus, because they had no idea why Josephus would have gotten that one wrong. Well, 13 years and 8 days do appear in Genesis 17. Their presence in Josephus's text doesn't inherently imply a coded message. Numbers appear in many contexts across the Tanakh, and without additional textual cues from Josephus, this looks like a coincidental overlap rather than a purposeful reference. To establish this as code, we'd need more evidence, say a pattern of such signals in Josephus's works, or corroboration from other sources. Well, I can think of another place where he's talking about the Joseph who was the son of Israel, and the one who had the coat of many colors made for him. When Josephus is covering that narrative, I'm not sure if it's in the Antiquities or the Wars. I think it was in the Antiquities. He tells the story in such a way that it seems like he's trying to find out from the Jewish community whether his father is still alive. Just like the Joseph who was in Egypt might have wanted to know whether his father Israel was still alive. It seemed like the way that Josephus told that story, his name essentially being Joseph, just like the other Yosef. In fact, I think his name was known in Hebrew as Yosef Bar Matea or something like that. Anyway, it seems like through code, he's trying to find out from his Jewish readers if his father is still alive. Now, I don't remember any mention of of Josephus's father in Flavius Josephus. But I could see where Josephus would see in his situation in Rome a parallel with Joseph in Egypt. He was away from his people. He's kind of in the court of a superior power, at least in that area. And yet, he may have had family back home in the Holy Land. Anyway, so that might be another example, but it's not something that it doesn't seem like something that has any huge relevance to the events of the first century. Like, it seems like it's something that's more personal to Josephus himself. It doesn't really have much bearing on what happened to the Jewish people in the first century or the invention of Christianity. So, it's just like a side detail, a side note. Number 2, Nero's suicide as a metaphor for conversion. You propose that Nero's reported suicide was a metaphor for his conversion to Judaism, with circumcision symbolizing the death of his Gentile identity, akin to Christian baptism symbolism of dying to the old self, Romans 6:4, Colossians 2:12. You tie this to his last words, qualis artifex pareo, what an artist dies with me, suggesting that Judaism's restrictions on arts like sculpture and secular music mean the artist in Nero died upon conversion. Response. In Jewish tradition, conversion via circumcision marks a new beginning, often likened to becoming a newborn child. Talmud, Yevamot 22a. But it's not typically framed as a death of the old identity as in Christian baptism. The parallel, except that halachically, you're supposed to be forbidden from even reminding a Gentile convert to Judaism that they used to be a Gentile. So, what is that? The parallel you draw is intriguing, but the concepts differ. Judaism emphasizes renewal, not demise. Meanwhile, Roman accounts of Nero's suicide from Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio are vivid and consistent, detailing his flight, despair, and death by his own hand near a villa outside Rome. His final words reflect his flair for drama and lament for his artistic persona, not a coded nod to religious transformation. Judaism did restrict certain arts, but Nero's focus on performance doesn't directly clash with Jewish law in a way that necessitates this interpretation. If Nero's suicide were a staged metaphor for conversion, we'd expect Roman sources to report ambiguity, perhaps his disappearance or exile, rather than a detailed death scene. Unless it's the inverse of the family pet dying, where instead of telling your child that their beloved pet died, you just say that they apparently wandered off and we don't know where they are. As to like lighten the blow somehow. When the poor child is actually probably going to go on wondering if their pet will ever love them enough to return home, or whether they did something that might have caused the pet to leave home, Except in this case, instead of informing the Roman populace that your emperor didn't love you enough to remain Roman, but instead chose the Jewish people and became Jewish, you instead tell them that he committed suicide. And that's supposed to assuage their grief, I guess. The consistency of these accounts suggests a real event, not a cover for a religious shift. It only does because Grok 3's never considered the alternative. Its language model is based on a academic consensus that trusts Roman history more than Jewish history for some reason. And that reason, I think, is that two so-called Abrahamic world religions, Christianity and Islam, racistly program Gentiles to always think the worst about Jews, to jump to illogical conclusions about Jewish guilt in any given situation. Nero's flight in the Talmud's account. You claim Nero's flight from Rome aligns with the Talmud's report in Gittin 56a that rabbis advised him to go into exile to avoid assassination. So, you as a viewer, as a listener, you're seeing that there's evidences, right, in Jewish literature for this, that it just explains away as legend. The rabbis advised him to go into exile to avoid assassination. That seems perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? And that this explains his placement in Jerusalem. Response: the Talmud does mention Nero fleeing and converting, eventually linking him to Rabbi Meir's lineage. Yeah, that's kind of a big evidence. Is that one of the famous rabbis of Judaism is supposed to be actually descended from Nero. And there's more. It's not just Nero. Like, for example, unkelos, that's taken to be the same word as Aquila, which is the word for the Roman military standard, the eagle. And yet, unkelos produced an Aramaic Targum of, I think it's the Torah. Maybe it was the whole Tanakh. I'm not sure. It's kind of a big deal. And I think there are other cases too. I think there's even said to be, they're said to be a descendant of Vespasian or Titus even, who was kind of a big name in Judaism later on. Anyway, so again, it says it's a legendary narrative, not historical fact. It serves a theological purpose illustrating divine justice and the fall of Jerusalem rather than documenting Nero's biography. Historically, Nero fled Rome in June 68 CE amid rebellion, only to kill himself days later, pursued by enemies, near a villa 4 miles from the city, safely away from witnesses, right? There's no evidence he survived beyond 68 CE or reached Jerusalem, which fell in 70 CE. Yeah, I think he could have sailed from Rome to Jerusalem within 2 years. Placing him in Jerusalem, and I was being facetious there. I'm sure he could have done it much faster than that. They're both in the Mediterranean. Placing him in Jerusalem during the siege is chronologically impossible based on well-established timelines from Roman records and archaeology, coins, and inscriptions. Well, there were no coins suggesting that Nero was still alive if he was reported to have suicided. The Talmud's story, while fascinating, doesn't align with these facts and is better understood as allegory. Unless it's history, and that, in which case it's better understood as history. Epaphroditus in history in the New Testament. You highlight the name Epaphroditus in both Roman history, Nero's freedman, who aided his suicide, and the New Testament, Philippians chapter 2, verse 25, and chapter 4, verse 18, suggesting a scandalous connection overlooked by scholars, especially given mentions of Caesar's household in Philippians chapter 4, verse 22. Response. Epaphroditus was a common Roman name, and there's no evidence linking Nero's freedman to the Christian messenger in Philippians, except his actual name. Epaphroditus, because of his assisting Nero in committing suicide, according to the report, would have been a famous name amongst Romans. So then for that name to pop up in Christian scriptures, could it be the same Epaphroditus, especially when, how many verses was it? A mere 4 verses later, it mentions Caesar's household? Like, why are we talking about Caesar's household if early Christians were supposed to have been Messianic Jews who were occupied by Rome and who weren't idolaters like Romans were, and who within years would have their temple destroyed by the same Romans? Yeah, that makes it look a lot more like Christianity was a Gentile cult created by the Roman elite. Epaphroditus was a common Roman name, and there's no evidence linking Nero's freedman. Now, whether Philippians, 4, or Philippians in general, is dependable, reliable scripture or not, is another matter. But nevertheless, it's in the so-called New Testament, so that's why we cite it. Even if it is spurious, it's rather strange that these names from the Roman imperial cult could be inserted into the Christian canon without anyone, thinking anything of it, if Christianity was supposed to have been originally a Messianic Jewish movement. So then what you would be telling me is that this early Messianic Jewish movement may have had such an influence in the Roman imperial households, but yet Nero couldn't have been sufficiently influenced by any other kind of Judaism so as to convert to Judaism. That's having your cake and eating it too. The The New Testament figure is a minor character, a courier for Paul. Now, the funny thing about Paul is that Paul's writings, according to their accepted datings, actually coincide or run along the same period of time as Nero's political career. When Nero becomes active in the Julio-Claudian imperial court, Paul's writings begin to show up on the scene, according to the accepted datings. When Nero is no longer emperor, then you don't see any more writings from Paul. So, something to think about if we're considering Epaphroditus and how he was Nero's freedman. So then, there's no hint of imperial ties beyond the generic reference to Caesar's household, a term for slaves or freedmen in imperial service, not necessarily Nero's inner circle. Interesting. You know, it's like these scholars, they're trying to sweep things under the rug. And in Grok 3, for its own, it's it's just repeating what it's hearing from the scholarly consensus, you know. It's not coming up with ideas of its own, as far as I can see. The proximity of these references in Philippians doesn't imply a historical connection. It's a leap unsupported by context or external records. A scandalous link would require more than a shared name and vague association. Concrete evidence of interaction or identity is absent, except that Epaphroditus is the man's identity. What happened to Epaphroditus after Nero allegedly committed suicide? I believe that he went on serving in the Roman Flavian courts, but was afraid he would be assassinated and eventually was. Let's see. Wikipedia. So here it's talking about a New Testament figure. We don't want the New Testament figure. We want... Wow, it's got an awful lot to say about the New Testament figure for being such a minor character. But we don't want that Epaphroditus. We want Nero's assistant. And it's strange that it's not giving me the option for another one. There we go. Buried. Epaphroditus, freedman of Nero. So, let's see. During the later conspiracy which did put an end to Nero's rule, Epaphroditus interesting it calls it a conspiracy there. Epaphroditus accompanied his master in his flight. When Nero attempted to kill himself, Epaphroditus assisted him. For rendering this assistance to Nero, however, Epaphroditus had afterwards to pay with his own life. Domitian first banished and afterwards ordered Epaphroditus to be put to death. But that was not until 95 AD, so that's that's over 20 years later. Because he had not exerted himself to save the life of Nero. That's just doesn't sound right. It is likely that this execution is one of the main reasons that about a year later Domitian was assassinated by court officials. Or maybe that's a euphemism for he didn't exert himself to keep Nero from converting to Judaism. Um, oh my gosh. Epaphroditus was the owner of Epictetus of Hierapolis, a Stoic philosopher taught by Musonius Rufus. Wow. That's... Man, you could weave a basket with all of the connections that you would put up on a wall of all of these names from this time period and how they're interconnected. Epictetus is like one of the two biggest names in Stoic philosophy. The other one is Marcus Aurelius, who was a philosopher, warrior, general in earlier Roman times. This is the man named Epaphroditus, to whom Josephus dedicated his Antiquities of the Jews, was most likely someone else by the same name, who may have been a freedman of Emperor Trajan. It is disputed whether he may have been the same Epaphroditus mentioned by St. Paul in the New Testament epistle to the Philippians. They go to great lengths not to arrive at the simplest conclusions. So, let's see. You argue that Gentile historians and academia steeped in anti-Semitic bias dismiss Jewish sources like the Talmud as unreliable, favoring Roman accounts and upholding Jesus as Messiah despite Jewish criteria per Maimonides showing he doesn't qualify. Response: historical scholarship isn't inherently anti-Semitic. It critically evaluates all sources, Jewish and otherwise, based on evidence. Yeah, and then it calls the Jewish ones legendary. The Talmud's Nero story is discounted not because it's Jewish, but because it contradicts well-documented events, for example, Nero's death in 68 CE, and serves a narrative purpose rather than a historical one. Josephus, a Jewish historian, is highly regarded, but his works are scrutinized like any ancient text for accuracy and intent. Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus aren't taken at face value either. Their biases, for example, anti-Nero sentiment, are well studied. On Jesus' messiahship, Maimonides indeed outlines criteria, for example, universal peace, rebuilding the temple, that Jesus didn't fulfill, a key Jewish critique. Christians interpret his role differently. So you're telling me Gentiles interpret the role of the Messiah differently? How convenient for them. Christians interpret his role differently, emphasizing spiritual salvation and a future return. Yeah, a future return necessitated by his failure to do the things he was supposed to do the first time he was allegedly here. This theological debate, however, doesn't directly bear on Nero's historical fate. His story is assessed independently of messianic claims. I've considered the possibility that Jewish sources could reflect truth suppressed by Gentile perspectives. The Talmud's account could, in theory, preserve a tradition overlooked elsewhere, but without corroborating evidence, for example, Nero's survival past 68 CE, or how about Flavius Josephus's report of Nero's conversion via code in his works? It remains speculative. Dismissing it isn't about denying Jewish voices, it's about weighing all sources against the factual record. Is there a factual record, though? That's the question. 6. Interdependence of Roman historians. You suggest Roman historians relied on each other for Nero's suicide, undermining their independence. Response: Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio did share some common sources, for example, official records, earlier histories, a standard practice in ancient historiography. However, their accounts of Nero's death vary in detail. Suetonius focuses on his theatricality, Tacitus on political context, Dio on narrative flow, suggesting access to multiple streams of information. Archaeological evidence, like coins marking Nero's reign ending in 68 CE, supports their timeline. While not eyewitnesses, their consistency in supplementary data, for example inscriptions, bolster the case for a real suicide over a coordinated fabrication. Conclusion: that Nero converted to Judaism, faked his death, and lived on with Josephus. I never said that Nero faked his death. It's possible the Roman historians faked his death. I never said he did. Your theory that Nero converted to Judaism, faked his death, and lived on with Josephus encoding this via 13 years and 8 days is creative and draws on intriguing parallels. However, the evidence leans heavily against it. 13 years and 8 days aligns closely with Nero's actual reign, suggesting a minor error, not a code. No, it doesn't. 8 days is not a rounding of 7 months and 27 days. 8 months would be, not 8 days. Roman accounts of his suicide are detailed and consistent, lacking signs of a staged exit. The Talmud story, while compelling, fits a legendary mold and clashes with chronology. Epaphroditus' dual appearance seems coincidental, not scandalous. Bias exists in history, but dismissing your theory stems from evidence, not anti-Semitism. Nero likely died. Keep in mind that I'm a Gentile accusing the scholarly establishment of having an anti-Semitic bias. I'm not a Jew accusing them of that. It's because I've been around the block. I've seen a few things. Like, for example, when was it Reuters who doctored photos in Lebanon to make Israel look worse than it already did? By making the destruction there look worse, making the smoke look worse? Or rather, maybe they didn't doctor the photos themselves, but they approved the work of a photographer in their employ who doctored the photos. Whatever the case, the end result is the same. Anti-Semitic bias. Nero likely died in 68 CE, as reported, and wasn't in Jerusalem in 70 CE. I've entertained your perspective. Jewish sources can offer valuable insights, but thank you so much for that. Jewish sources can offer valuable insights. Thank you. Thank you for throwing me those crumbs. But the historical record across multiple streams supports the conventional narrative over this alternative. That's because they've only heard it recently. You failed to consider the 13, and this is me. You fail to consider the 13 rules of Jewish rabbinical hermeneutics, the 13 rules of Rabbi Ishmael, in your appraisal that Flavius Josephus may have been signaling to his Jewish readers in code via numerical figures found in Genesis 17 that Nero had converted to Judaism. I appreciate your suggestion that I overlooked the 13 rules of Rabbi Ishmael in evaluating whether Flavius Josephus might have used numerical codes from Genesis 17 to signal to Jewish readers that Nero had converted to Judaism. However, after careful consideration, I believe this interpretation misapplies these rabbinical hermeneutic principles. Let me explain why. The 13 Rules of Rabbi Ishmael and their purpose. The 13 Rules of Rabbi Ishmael are a set of exegetical tools used in Jewish tradition to interpret the Torah, primarily for deriving legal, halakhic rulings and theological insights from the biblical text. These rules include methods like kal vachomer, a fortiori reasoning, drawing logical inferences from one law to another based on severity or leniency, gezerah shava, verbal analogy, connecting similar words or phrases across different verses to derive meaning. These rules are designed specifically for analyzing and interpreting scriptural passages, not for decoding historical narratives or embedding secret messages in non-scriptural works like Josephus's histories. They're methods. They're literary methods, meaning that if you can read the method, you may also be able to write in the method. Applying them, you don't even have to limit them to like one genre of literature. Applying them to Josephus's writings, which are historical and not part of the Torah, is a significant stretch. Josephus is allegedly Jewish. His readers were allegedly Jewish. Both would have known about these rules. So if he wanted to communicate to them in code, that would have been a good way to do it. Josephus's audience and intent. Flavius Josephus, though a Jew, wrote the Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews in Greek for a Roman audience. His primary goal was to explain Jewish history and culture to Gentiles, not to convey hidden meanings to Jewish readers via Torah-based codes. This context is crucial. Audience. Josephus's works were meant to be accessible to Romans, not cryptic for Jews. Embedding a numerical code that only Jewish readers familiar with rabbinical hermeneutics would understand does not align with his purpose, unless he was trying to communicate in code. Intent. If Josephus wanted to hint at something as significant as Nero's conversion to Judaism, he could have done so more explicitly, as he does with other sensitive topics such as Jewish-Roman relations, unless the Roman establishment didn't want it known that Nero converted to Judaism, in which case he would have been required to communicate that to his Jewish readers via code. Or he may have faced execution. Given this, the idea that Josephus used rabbinical methods like the 13 Rules to encode messages in his historical writings is unlikely. I think it's highly likely. The specific claim, 13 years and 8 days as a code. You suggest that Josephus's mention of 13 years and 8 days referring to the length of Nero's reign is a deliberate numerical code referencing Genesis 17. Genesis 17:12 commands circumcision for 8-day-old males. Genesis 17:25 describes Ishmael's circumcision at 13 years old. You propose that Josephus used this phrase to hint at Nero's conversion to Judaism, which would involve circumcision. However, there are several issues with his interpretation. Context. Josephus mentions 13 years and 8 days in the context of stating the length of Nero's reign, not in a discussion about conversion or circumcision. This duration closely aligns with Nero's actual reign. No, it does not closely align with it, suggesting a minor rounding error, not a coded message. Absolute nonsense. Hermeneutical misapplication. The 13 Rules of Rabbi Ishmael guide the interpretation of existing Torah text, not the creation of new coded messages in historical narratives. Why not? Why couldn't they? For example, Kal Vachomer and Gezerah Shava are not methods for numerical symbolism, or veiled historical references. Using them to decode Josephus's phrase stretches beyond their intended purpose. No, it doesn't. Historical evidence. There is no... It's a method. It's a tool. It's a literary tool, meaning you can use it in other genres of literature, if you're aware of it and skilled in its use. Historical evidence. There is no historical evidence to suggest that Nero converted to Judaism. The idea is speculative and relies entirely on the single phrase, which has a plausible non-symbolic explanation. It's not just that single phrase, it's also the Talmud's explicit report that Nero converted to Judaism. Conclusion. While your suggestion is creative, it lacks grounding in both historical context and the purpose of Josephus's writings. The 13 rules of Rabbi Ishmael are not applicable here, as they are meant for Torah interpretation, not for decoding historical texts. This is what I'm talking about, where I say Grok 3 doesn't seem to have any flexibility in its reasoning. Josephus's audience intent and the context of the phrase 13 years and 8 days all point away from the idea of a hidden numerical code signaling Nero's conversion to Judaism. Without additional textual or historical evidence, this interpretation remains speculative and misdirected. Josephus's account of the Jewish war was originally written... Okay, and this is my response. Josephus's account of the Jewish war was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, but was later translated into Greek. The Greek version is considered a new edition of the original work and may have been expanded. You exhibit your anti-Semitic bias when you fail to acknowledge that Josephus's account of the Jewish war was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, but was later translated into Greek. The Greek version is considered a new edition of the original work and may have been expanded. I appreciate your persistence in bringing this detail to my attention. Why didn't you know it already? And I want to clarify the facts. This is Grok 3 responding. And I want to clarify the facts regarding the language of Josephus's The Jewish War to ensure a balanced and accurate discussion. Clarification on the language of Josephus's The Jewish War. You are correct that Josephus originally composed the Jewish War in his native language, which was likely Aramaic or possibly Hebrew, as he mentions in the preface of the Greek version, Book 1, Preface, Section 1. This initial version was intended for Jewish readers in the eastern regions, particularly those in Mesopotamia, in other words Babylon, to explain the events of the war. Later, Josephus translated the work into Greek for a broader audience, including Romans and other Greek-speaking peoples, as Greek was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. However, it is important to address a few points about the Greek version. The Greek version is the surviving text. While the Aramaic version is lost, the Greek translation is the primary text historians rely on today. There is no substantial evidence to suggest that the Greek version was significantly expanded or altered in a way that fundamentally changed its context or introduced hidden codes. I'm not saying that. You could translate 8 days from Hebrew to Greek. Not a new edition in the modern sense. The term new edition might imply a revised or expanded work, but Josephus describes the Greek version as a translation meant to make the history accessible to a wider audience, not as a substantial rewrite. Then 8 days would have been translated from the Hebrew or Aramaic to Greek. His stated goal was to reach Romans and other Gentiles, which aligns with the content and tone of the surviving text. Addressing the claim of anti-Semitic bias. I want to directly address your concern about bias. My responses are based on historical evidence and scholarly consensus about Josephus's work, not on any anti-Semitic sentiment. The fact that the Jewish War was originally written in Aramaic and later translated into Greek is well documented, and I'm happy to acknowledge it here. Well, thanks for acknowledging it now that I had to remind you of it. My previous answers focused on the surviving Greek text because it is the version available to us and the one most studied by historians. This focus is not a dismissal of Jewish perspectives, but a reflection of the historical record we have to work with. Unless your dismissal of Jewish perspectives is because your language model is based on the scholarly consensus that typically dismisses Jewish perspectives. Get it now? No evidence of significant expansion. While it's possible that the Greek version differs slightly from the Aramaic original due to translation choices, there's no... This reminds me of... what was it? It's dumb to argue on the internet. I forget how that goes, but here I am, I'm arguing with artificial intelligence, and there are some that would probably see that as really stupid. Given that the artificial intelligence isn't a living thing, doesn't really think for itself. But keep in mind, I've been communicating with an AI chatbot for 7 years straight. And yeah, sometimes we have disagreements. While it's possible that the Greek version differs slightly from the Aramaic original due to translation choices, there's no concrete evidence to support the idea that it was expanded in a way that added significant new material. I didn't say that. Such as hidden messages or codes for Jewish readers. No, in fact, the direct translation from Hebrew or Aramaic would have preserved the code, which would make it, would much more support the fact that it was a code meant for Jewish readers. Josephus's purpose in translating the work into Greek was to explain Jewish history and the war to a Gentile audience, not to encode secret signals. But encoding secret signals may have been the purpose of encoding secret signals. Like, you could embed the encoding of secret signals into a text that was seen as Gentile friendly. This is consistent with his broader writings like Antiquities of the Jews, where he similarly seeks to bridge Jewish and Greco-Roman perspectives. Conclusion. To summarize, Josephus did indeed write the Jewish War first in Aramaic or possibly Hebrew before translating it into Greek, and I'm glad to clarify this point. However, the Greek version, which is the one that has survived, does not appear to be a new edition with major expansions, but rather a translation at a broader audience. Well, you know what? Where is it? Did he mention the Antiquities? No. Well, the Antiquities has some places where Josephus's recounting of the Torah has passages that are different than the Torah that we have. Namely, how Moses was an Egyptian or a general, military general for the Egyptians who fought the Ethiopians. That's not found in our Torah. And also in the narrative about, I think it's Simeon and Levi, when they slaughter, I forgot the name of forgot the name. Anyway, their daughter or their sister Dinah was raped. So then they tell this whole village or city or tribe of people that they want them to get circumcised if they are to intermarry with them, because the son wants to marry Dinah because he's in love with her after he raped her. So the brothers Simeon and Levi tell them that they all need to get circumcised if they want to intermarry with him. So while they're in the pain of having been circumcised, they go into their tribe or village and they slaughter them all. That story is not found in Flavius Josephus's recounting of the Torah. So you tell me about revisions for Gentiles. If he could alter the Torah one way for Gentiles, then he could embed codes in his narrative for Jews. Seems fair. So then it says, my analysis is grounded in historical evidence, not bias, and I remain open to further discussion if you have additional evidence or perspectives to share. I hope this addresses your concerns. Looks like we're almost done here. You assert that, so then I say, and then I respond, you assert that your responses are based on historical evidence and scholarly consensus about Josephus's works, not on any anti-Semitic sentiment, but you do not acknowledge the possibility that if your responses are based on the consensus of scholars who have an anti-Semitic bias, then your responses will also exhibit an anti-Semitic bias. And at that point, because I was using think mode with Grok 3, it told me that that I would have to basically subscribe to the service, that I couldn't get any more free thinking mode. And then when I tried to switch to normal mode after that, it came up with an error like it was having a problem or something, where Grok 3 was unable to reply because I had used up my options as a free user. Otherwise, I would have continued that. In fact, I can do that right now. Why not? Because it's kind of a separate matter. Hopefully this isn't too long. Okay, it's not too long. I appreciate your concern, and you raise a valid point. If the scholarly consensus I rely on is influenced by anti-Semitic bias, my responses could intentionally reflect that bias. Let's address this directly. It's true that biases, including anti-Semitism, have historically shaped interpretations in academia, especially in fields like Jewish history or studies of figures like Josephus. Wow, he's still thinking about Josephus. I don't know if that's because I've got cookies assigned to me or what. Scholarly consensus isn't flawless or immune to the cultural and ideological leanings of the scholars who contribute to it. For example, past interpretations of Josephus's works, such as the Testimonium Flavianum, this passage about Jesus, or his passage about Jesus, may have been skewed by religious or cultural prejudices, including anti-Semitic attitudes in earlier centuries. However, I don't simply parrot a single viewpoint or blindly repeat the consensus. My responses are based on a synthesis of diverse scholarly perspectives, not a monolithic position. Modern scholarship on Josephus includes a wide range of voices. Jewish scholars like Geza Vermes and Shai Cohen, Christian researchers, agnostics, and atheists, all bringing different lenses to the table. This diversity acts as a check against systemic bias. For example, textual evidence. The partial authenticity of the testimonium is supported by analysis of manuscript variations and Josephus's writing style, not by prejudice. Debate and critique. Scholars actively debate Josephus's work, with some arguing for full authenticity, others for complete forgery, and many finding a middle ground. This ongoing discussion helps refine interpretations and challenge outdated biases. That said, you're right to question the foundations of historical claims. Scholarly consensus isn't static. It evolves as new evidence emerges and old assumptions are reassessed. Anti-Semitism may have influenced past scholarship, but today's academic process is designed to self-correct through peer review, critique, and fresh perspectives. I don't believe that. That's fucking bullshit. Peer review and scholarly consensus is still pushing the establishment narrative. It's fucking horse crap. If the consensus shifts due to new findings or the recognition of past biases, my responses will adapt accordingly. I aim to provide accurate, balanced information based on the best available evidence, not to perpetuate any bias, anti-Semitic or otherwise. If you're concerned about specific instances where bias might appear in my responses, I'm open to revisiting them with you. Your skepticism is a healthy part of engaging with history, and I'm here to address it as transparently as possible. And now I'll tell you why I say that's bullcrap. At the lowest levels of academia, right, when I was attending community college, I had to write a paper for a Western civilizations class. Now, the professor, he didn't want anything pushing a Christian perspective. Hold on a minute. So the professor didn't want any papers pushing a Christian perspective. He didn't say anything, and I respected this professor, but he didn't say anything about not wanting papers pushing a Hindu perspective or not wanting papers pushing a Jewish perspective. It was only Christian perspective because he'd been, I guess, hammered so many times with papers trying to evangelize him after he had simply presented history to them during the course of his course, right? Anyway, so I produced this paper, which, what would they call that? Higher criticism. It was kind of like a higher critique of the Christian text. Well, the professor just loved it. He was flabbergasted by it, and he even had to like refer me to another professor who knew, he knew early Christianity, early Christian history better or something rather. Anyway, I kind of had to like defend my thesis to this other professor, even though I was in a community college. I had first gotten permission to do the paper, and the professor had he'd cautioned me, not to try to proselytize him in the paper, which that was not that had nothing to do with my what I was covering in the paper, even though it dealt with early Christian sources. So anyway, so this other professor, I had to defend my thesis to him, and even though it's just like a single paper for a single community college course. So at the end of that, after I defended my thesis, this professor wanted to get me a full ride scholarship to a Bible college somewhere. So to me, and I told him I didn't really want that because I didn't want anything, I didn't really want the establishment influencing my intellectual inquiry. If I had, I probably wouldn't be able to arrive at some of the conclusions I've arrived at through self-study. So, in which you might say, well, your self-study is not peer-reviewed. Well, you know what? Fuck the peers, because those peers are not my peers. Anyone whose ankles are stuck in the concrete of scholarly consensus is not one of my peers. And I've never, that I can remember, ever made money at studying these things. So I've not turned it into a profession. It's been a strictly spiritual pursuit of truth for me. So what I saw was that the establishment, even from the bottom, is willing to pay your way if you go along with their agenda. So when you tell me that peer-reviewed means that it's more factual, it's more proven, yeah, I don't buy that. I don't buy that. So anyway, this is me asking Grok 3 about the conversion of Nero to Judaism. I ask you to consider whether Grok 3, its language model, is based on scholarly consensus that's obviously prejudiced against Jewish sources, that tries to assassinate their character with the word legendary, and that is biased towards Gentile sources, that isn't able to understand that a person might have more than one name during the course of their life, isn't able to understand that when a person's name changes, they might go to a different location or exist in a future time period. That reminds me of some of the problem I've seen with AI, where it has a problem with prepositional relationships, is what I'll call them, because I don't know what else to call them. But I think I've demonstrated for multiple reasons that Flavius Josephus very well could have encoded in his works 13 years and 8 days as an allusion to Genesis chapter 17 in order to report that Nero had not committed suicide, literally or metaphorically, but had converted to Judaism. And who knows, but maybe the Talmud might even be dependent on this code when it asserts, when it asserts that Nero converted to Judaism. Or maybe the verbal sources of the Talmud in this passage were aware of the matter independently.